I think that is why you end up with people saying, Trump pardon everybody. We don't trust the system anymore. I mean, you had those two individuals in New York who were giving out Molotov cocktails.
Look at this. Look at this. Look at this game they have to play with themselves. Look at this. Whatever it is, they will find a way to get there. Donald Trump tomorrow could ban blue jeans. I don't like blue jeans. They come from China. And they would find a way to get there. Tim Pool would find a way to get there. Well, actually, you know what? I looked at the study from Denmark in 1972, and jeans, they give you chlamydia.
And then when someone comes to me and says that Donald Trump is guilty of a crime, I say, yeah, I'm reading those documents.
But you didn't, you idiot! You didn't read the documents. We know this.
I just don't believe it. I can't believe it. And I think that's the reasonable take.
Tim Pool doesn't deserve rights. Like, he just doesn't. Tim Pool made a video talking about the January 6th pardons. Can't wait to hear his take on that.
Now, there's a viral... Ladies and gentlemen, Trump pardons roughly 1,500 criminal defendants charged in the
Is that Khanna? Is that Khanna on the Tim Pool show? Doth my eyes deceive me? Hopefully he has some good takes here, bro.
January 6th Capitol attack. The sweeping pardons would mark the beginning of the end of one of the largest investigations in FBI history. They say that President Donald Trump said on Monday that he was issuing roughly 1,500 pardons and commuting the sentences of 6 of his supporters in connection with the J6 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol, when thousands of them stormed the building amid his false claims that the
Now, if you guys will recall, the initial reporting on what was probably going to happen with respect to these pardons was that they were going to look at things on a case by case. All of his surrogates and he himself, Trump, was saying over and over and over again, we just got to look at these cases. Cam Bondi, I believe, the incoming attorney general, I believe when she was testifying, she said, we will look at these things on a case by case. J.D. Vance, as early as maybe Sunday, I think it was, said something to the effect of like, if you committed violence against a police officer, obviously you shouldn't get a pardon. And then there was some reporting that came out last night that indicated that Donald Trump literally, quote, said the words, F it, let's just, I can't remember what he said, like, let's just do it all. They did not look at things on a case-by-case situation. Donald Trump was grilled on specific instances of, well, you pardoned this guy who dragged cops into a crowd and beat them with batons, and you gave them a pardon. Do you have anything to say about that? And Trump deflected to, well, you know, a lot of murderers, they get less jail time and blah blah. You didn't address any of the substance. So at some point he just said, I'm just going to pardon everybody. And literally, according to the reporting, he said, according to people like on background. And I expressed frustrations on Monday in the Live and Learn podcast that we recorded that, like, even though I don't think the Biden pardons are in the same universe as blanket pardoning 1,500 people that stormed the Capitol violently or otherwise. They're not even, the fact that they're even in the same conversation is stupid. But it was frustrating to me that Biden took those actions because I knew, like, okay, I know exactly what these dumb motherfuckers are going to say when you try to criticize Trump for something that is so fucking egregious. Like pardoning people that physically assaulted cops. Over 170 injuries of police officers on January 6th. One guy lost 3 of his fingers. One guy lost an eye. Another one had his spine basically like crushed ribs, multiple sides shortly after that. And he just pardoned them. And these dumb motherfuckers, and I'm sure it's going to come up in this thing, they think that like, oh, but Biden pardon. Like, I understand that like the Biden pardons are unprecedented. It is also unprecedented for a incoming president to telegraph, we're going to get retribution. We're going to come after you. And for his nominated director of the FBI to have a public enemies list. Now that's unprecedented. So I don't know how to judge Biden's actions. Like my selfish impulse is to be frustrated with him because these people think it's they believe this false equivalence. Like, oh, but Biden pardoned his family though. So I don't give a that you pardon this guy who injured a cop so bad that the cop had to retire. But here we are. We already know it's, are people even going to be talking about the January 6th pardons like 2 weeks from now? It's so egregious.
2020 presidential election was rigged against him. He made the remarks after returning to the White House Monday evening. An attorney for Enrique Tarrio, the Proud Boy leader convicted of seditious conspiracy, told NBC News on Monday that his client was being processed for release from FCI Pollock, a media...
Now remember, Luke Beasley was on Tim Pool's podcast like 2 weeks ago, and Tim Pool was like, what did Enrique Tarrio do? What did he do? You dumb twink lib. You. What did he do? You don't know anything. This is why I hate liberals. You don't know any facts. And then Luke Beasley was like, well, actually, I can just pull up the article here. Enrico Tarrio was convicted of this, and this. Then Tim Pool got real quiet. He got real quiet after that. And there was a really great moment too, where Luke Beasley, like shortly after that moment, was like, are we going to acknowledge that you just freaked the out on me and you were wrong? Can we just acknowledge that for a minute? And Tim Pool was like, well, actually, I'm looking through the Wikipedia article right now, and I can't see any evidence. It's like, okay, so look up the public court documents if you want to see the evidence. Jesus Christ.
Medium security federal prison in Louisiana. Tarrio is serving 22 years in federal prison after being convicted of seditious conspiracy.
He's going to say, well, he wasn't even in DC. Meanwhile, like Enrique Tarrio, they had him in WhatsApp and they had him in like encrypted messaging, telling people, do it again, keep going, directing people who were there on the Capitol that day, keep going.
He is being processed out. Now, there's a viral tweet that I believe it's from his mom saying that he is out of prison. So we expected this. Trump said he was going to do it. The rumor is that, I suppose, as he's saying, some of those who were violent and did go to prison and were convicted have been commuted, and then it's a blanket pardon for some 1,500 other people. I'm curious what you guys think. I'm curious.
He's making stuff up here. I don't know what he means. Like, some people were violent. There was a commuted. I don't know what, he's just making it up. There's nothing, I don't know what he's talking about there. The people who had their sentences commuted, I think, were the people that were convicted of the more serious seditious conspiracy stuff. Everybody else got blanket pardons, including the ones that pleaded guilty to violently assaulting cops on January 6th. This is one of the most lazy political commentators in the world, man. This guy does no homework. None.
What you, a congressman, think about all of this?
Well, look, I was there in the Capitol. I was in the Cannon building.
Khanna, I swear to God, bro. Listen, don't. If you let me down here, you're dead to me.
When that took place. And here's my view of it. If someone was out there caught up in the protest and just showed up and was swept in and went inside, I have a very different view of it than people who smash down buildings, threaten people.
He's dead to me.
People with violence, hit law enforcement officers. So I don't know the pardons, but my guess is that some of the people, from what you're saying, who pardoned it actually engaged in violence and destruction of property. And my view is I thought Trump was going to be against crime. I mean, the law and order president. So why is any kind of violence on federal property?
I mean, if his point is that it's worse to, like, if somebody followed the rioters into the building, that's going to be on a spectrum of bad, less bad than someone who was, like, let's say, stole a police officer's shield and beat them with it. Of course, there's going to be differences there. But it kind of sounds like he's like, well, if people just got caught up, I don't know how much, If you follow a group of people that you just watched violently clash with cops, and then you're climbing over broken glass to get into a building with the explicit intention of disrupting the peaceful transfer of power, the certification of the election, you deserve to go to jail.
Not zero tolerance.
Do you mean, so I think there's only 6 commutations. You're saying of the 15, you think it's likely that some of those probably did engage in violence?
Yeah, and the person for the seditious conspiracy, I mean, did he...
Tim, the text of the executive order was publicly available at the time you recorded this video. Why didn't you just look at the text of it instead of speculating? He pardoned everyone who was convicted of anything on that day and who were currently engaged in litigation. Pardoned them. Everyone got a pardon or a commutation.
If 22 years, you're sentenced to 22 years, you probably have done something that led to an imminent threat of violence. Maybe not.
Wasn't he walking in there?
Probably done something is a dangerous way to phrase it.
Well,
Tim, I know you're educated on this because Luke educated you. Tim Pool, I know you pulled up the Wikipedia article explaining in detail what Enrico Tarrio did. I just watched it. You did it 2 weeks ago. What other evidence, unless Tim smokes a shitload of weed and has no short-term memory, he's just lying. He's lying. He knows what Enrico Tarrio did. They just discussed this. I don't even think it was 2 weeks ago that they brought up the article and looked at the evidence. And now he's doing this like, he's just playing dumb. In his audience, They have to be the dumbest motherfuckers on the internet, because how many people in his audience watched that episode, and did they forget too? Did they all just forget? Are we going to see any Tim Pool fans in his comments?
Jan 6 pardons should be brought up anytime these Republicans moan and whine about crime and shit.
It's also wildly unpopular with the electorate. It's like a 2-to-1 margin. It's like 65% oppose these pardons and 30% support the crazy 30% diehard MAGA people in this country. It's like a 2-to-1 ratio. It is a wildly unpopular move what he did. The risk is that it's just going to get buried in like 90 other stories, which is the point. Like, this is the point. Donald Trump is starting his presidency with this blitzkrieg because it's hard to attack a single thing when there's like 95 things, and it just overwhelms people, and it's literally the point.
I trust the law. I trust the jury process there. And yeah, I mean, we're probably going to disagree on this issue, but I fundamentally believe that you can't go into the Capitol or plan things to go into the Capitol, engage in violence. That's different. Look, there were school teachers, they're dentists. They show up. They wanted to show their support. They got caught up in a frenzy. The doors are open. They go in. If they don't threaten anyone, don't have violence. I get that there was some of that was taking place, and I wouldn't go after that. But the people who were engaged in actually breaking the buildings, hurting law enforcement officers, or planning to do that, those people should be held accountable.
So there's going to be two things here. They've served enough time, and but Biden pardons. I promise you. And I am so unimpressed with Ro Khanna here. This milquetoast is a really good word for it. This milquetoast shit. Ro Khanna, how are you not adequately prepared to, you should know the facts of this to aggressively make your argument. He's like, well, you know, we're probably going to disagree. How, you know, like, if you're going to go into these spaces, at least in the case of like Luke, right? Like, he went in there like with the facts. He had a, you know, Luke is young, but he's impressive. He's very, very well informed.
I completely agree. I think that's why I've said commutation makes sense, only because if someone shoved a cop or pushed him 3 years, 4 years is a long time to be in prison for like shoving a cop. But for people who didn't know what was going on and walked into a building when the gates were down or open and got trespassed.
They stole batons from cops and used those batons to bludgeon cops. They stole cops' shields and used those shields to bludgeon cops. They sprayed chemical irritants at cops. They used stun guns on cops. There were several cops that had traumatic brain injuries. There were several cops that had to retire because their injuries were so severe. This whole like, well, you know, if you shoved a cop, it was not just like shoving cops. They were engaged in medieval battle, like they were charging the gates of Helm's Deep. God, I hate these people.
I agree with. I'm curious what you guys think.
Well, I think the biggest problem here is trusting that process, right? Because it was obviously abused. I have a friend. He's a photojournalist. He's independent. He was there that day. He wasn't even a registered Republican, but he was in there. He went inside, took photos, and walked out. He ended up getting sentenced to 4 years in prison for doing.
What's your friend's name? Let me see the case file. What's your friend's name? Let's look it up. I want to see what your friend pleaded guilty to, or was convicted of. Because I highly doubt that it was as he's characterizing. Let's see the name. Let's look it up together, please.
Just that. So when it comes down to the actual process, it was obviously being abused there. They were painting him in court as a hardcore Trump supporter, and this was an insurrection, and, you know, painting him that way in court. That's obviously a completely abused system right there, because just walking around, nonviolent, didn't do anything violent, walking around, taking photos and getting 4 years from that's completely unimaginable.
What's his name? Let's call this guy Bob. Bob, there was a violent mob outside your house, Bob. And this violent mob smashed your windows and kicked your door down and invaded your home and trespassed in your home. And I'm sitting there behind this violent mob and I'm watching it happen. And I followed that mob into your home. Should I be punished? Was it no big deal? Would you want me to go to jail? Oh, I didn't kick the door down. You know, I'm just following the people that I watched kick the door down. Should I go to jail for that, Bob? How are they not understanding these like very basic concepts of right and wrong and illegality?
And there were a lot of enhancements on the sentences that turned out to be all unconstitutional by SCOTUS. They were adding to the sentences where they shouldn't have been. But to add to all of this, George Washington, what?
You can tilt your mic down.
Okay. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I feel more comfortable. George Washington pardoned everybody who participated in the Whiskey Rebellion. And then Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson pardoned everybody, all the Confederates. So it's kind of a thought that once this is done, once you've made it through, once one side has won and one side has lost, quote unquote, just it's good. It's good for the country to just move forward and not to.
Okay, so I mean, let's say I get together with my friends now. And FBI, if you're listening, this is a hypothetical. I am not doing this. Let's say I get together with my friends now and I start planning for 2028. If the Republicans win, shit's gonna go down. And we start planning our own January 6th. And then we go through with it, right? And then it fails, and then we get caught and we get thrown in jail. Are you saying that JD Vance should pardon me for the good of the country at that point? Is that what you're saying? What is to dissuade people from doing this in the future? If we adhere to this principle of, well, anybody who does this kind of thing should just be pardoned for the good of the country. What would dissuade me from doing my own thing in 4 years? The reason why we have these laws and the punishments for the laws is to dissuade this sort of behavior. But she's saying for the sake of national unity, these people shouldn't face consequences? Excuse me?
Hold on to it just to start to heal in that way. What do you think about that?
I think, first of all, if it was a Democrat engaged in reconciliation, that's different than your own party. But look, that's why I said if someone was there, if this photojournalist is true, that he just walked in and took pictures, and if those facts are true, then I'd be very sympathetic to that person not being behind jail. And in general, I do think we have to find ways to come together as a country. But there were...
Khanna, why are you even giving them that? Why would you even grant them that? You are not dealing with honest brokers. These are not honest people. They know they're lying. They know they're obfuscating. They know they're omitting highly relevant context deliberately in an attempt to deceive you. You know this about, how do you not know this about these people? They're not serious actors. They're hyper partisan. They will not hesitate to completely fabricate things or distort things so long as it fits their narrative.
People who actually, smashed the Capitol building, who committed assault against law enforcement officers.
Yeah.
That should...
For sure. And then in 2 seconds, they're gonna defend the pardon. So they're agreeing with him now, like, oh yeah, no, that's serious, yeah. But then 2 minutes from now, less than 2 minutes from now, I'm gonna hear one or all of these dumb motherfuckers say, but Biden pardon, and they've served enough time.
Forget the politics of it. This is, I view the Capitol as a sacred place. Like that.
Do you believe in the pardons for the Confederates who probably did some pretty bad things too?
As much as some of the pundits want us to think we're in a civil war, we're not. So I think that was I don't. Reconstruction should have gone so much further. If Abraham Lincoln was not assassinated, oh my God, the country that we live in today would be so different had Abraham Lincoln not been assassinated and he was able to go through with his initial vision for what Reconstruction would have looked like. His successor threw all of that away, which gave way to 100 years of Jim Crow, and the consequences of that ripple to this day. A different context.
Let me ask you this. So I think the challenge that many of us have is on May 29th, 2020, there were several thousand far left activists, I would say many of them extremists, who tore down the barricades of the White House, firebombed the White House grounds, set fire to St. John's Church. Yeah. We did not see Capitol Police launch an investigation. We did not see FBI raids across the country. The president was forced into the emergency bomb.
There were 10,000 people that were arrested, many of them by federal authorities, during the summer protests of 2020. This idea that they had carte blanche to just destroy entire cities and nobody did anything. There were 10,000 people that were arrested that summer.
Bunker, the corporate
What's up, Khanna boy?
The media.
To be fair, it was Lincoln's fault for picking Johnson as VP. Yeah, that's true.
Mocked him over it, calling him Bunker Boy. So that
called him Bunker Bitch, to be honest.
Well before January 6th. Seeing the photos of the smoke rising up in D.C. all across the city from the chaos and the rioting, seeing no law enforcement action. For me, I'm kind of like, well, what else is new? I've been covering protests for a decade. Then when January 6th happens, to see a nationwide raid that actually resulted in, there was a woman in Alaska who was wrongly identified. They stormed her house. And I'm thinking to myself, they're willing to send the feds to Alaska to raid the wrong woman's home, and they won't even do a simple local investigation into who set fire to.
All right, Tim, let's hear it. Let's hear your proposed policies for criminal justice reform. I'm great. I'm happy to have this conversation. Tim Pool, give me some suggestions for how we can reform our law enforcement agencies to make sure that people don't suffer these kinds of injustices. Let's go. Let's hear your suggestions, right? Let's hear some broad policy changes to address these, dare I say, systemic issues. To hold cops more accountable when they make those kinds of mistakes. Let's hear those. I want to hear it, right?
St. John's Church. More importantly, who firebombed the guard post at the White House? Yeah. I mean, the White House grounds was on fire.
Yeah, there was about 60 Secret Service agents that were injured that night, dozens of police officers, dozens of vehicles, obviously St. John's Church as well.
Anytime somebody engages in a whataboutism like this, it's such a slam dunk response. Like, of course, anyone who tried to firebomb the White House should go to jail. Yes, I believe both things, right? Like, if you're firebombing the White House, you should be prosecuted. It should be a serious offense. You should go to jail.
Accountability for that.
Probably a really long time, right? I don't know what the sentencing guidelines are for that, but whatever, throw the book at people who do stuff like that. I have no love for goddamn communists that were trying to firebomb the White House in 2020. You certainly don't pardon these people, Tim. Like, if you want to make this equivalence between what happened then and what happened now, Joe Biden would have had to pardon someone who firebombed the White House. Did he do that? I'm sorry, did he do that?
I'm not defending left rioters and protesters, and if they are committing damage to the White House, if they're threatening law enforcement officers, absolutely, they should be going to prison for that. I mean, after a trial. I get your point. You're saying that the police, you feel the law enforcement are singling out people because they're conservative and supporting Donald Trump in a way they aren't on the left. Now, I'll tell you, on the left, they feel the opposite in this country. I mean, it's everyone is coming from their perspective of bias. The left says, no, the cops target folks on the left more. My view is, how do we get to a point in this country where we can agree that we should allow for protests, give people the benefit of the doubt, but when people are engaged in violence, there should be zero tolerance.
Honestly, it seems like the Democrat standard right now, just pardoning every single person, even if they were violent, even if they did do crazy things, that's like the Democrat standard that I've noticed the last.
What? What is he talking about? Who is saying this? What the f*** is he talking about?
4 years, so maybe we just do that.
Yeah, I really don't. I don't want to engage in whataboutism, and I share your.
But I'm about to engage in whataboutism. Yes, he's
your
about
opinion. Yeah. But it's really hard to say that we need to hold the J6 rioters accountable, and that we do have to worry about the rule of law when there have been multiple times, not that I'm not going to get specific because, again, I don't want to get into whataboutism, but there have been multiple times where it seems like one political opinion is suppressed and another political opinion isn't. So it's really, I agree with you and I understand your position, but it's really hard to accept that it's.
Let's just speak in vague generalities without getting into any specifics. Like, I have no idea what he means when he says this. What the f are you talking about? Can we get some specifics here?
That now it matters when there have been multiple times in the past, 5 or so years that that hasn't been the standard.
The George Floyd riots were some of the worst we've seen in decades.
The most destructive in U.S. history.
Universally condemned by Democratic leadership. Did you see Joe Biden pardon people who were arrested and jailed for any kind of violent offenses and during those riots? No. He would have a leg to stand on if Joe Biden pardoned people that were sitting in federal jails right now because of rioting from 2020. He would have a leg to stand on. Biden did that. He didn't do that. You can call into question some of Biden's other pardons, and I think I agree. I don't know. I kind of go both ways on that one. I think I agree. I think I don't love a lot of the pardons that Biden went. He also pardoned like tons of nonviolent drug offenses, like people convicted of nonviolent drug offenses. I'm fully on board with that. I love all that. I think that's been a big problem with our prison system for decades. We're just wasting all this money and time and resources on nonviolent drug offenses. It's insane to me. The family pardons, I think, are like I get why he did it, but it's still, I still don't love those. The J6, like Liz Cheney pardon and Adam Schiff and all, like I don't love those. It's unprecedented because this is new, right? So we don't have presidents that run on a platform of like, I'm going to be a retribution and we're going to go after these people. That's never been a thing for presidential candidates before Donald Trump came around. So I understand the motivation to do it, but for my own selfish purposes, because I know these dipshits are going to do this whataboutism bullshit. It's like, they're just going to, to them, the conversation ends. It's like, I don't give a fuck about the January 6th stuff. He pardoned his brother or whatever. Like, okay. All right. Well, I guess that's that, right?
I think it's somewhere in the mid-20s of confirmed deaths from the rioting, and then
$30 billion or something like that in damage.
There were an additional 10 deaths from ancillary instances. There was the murdering of retired Officer Dorn, I believe. A police department was burned to the ground.
A federal building was under siege for 30 days.
No, it was like over 100 days.
Portland? It was over 100 days.
So that was over 100 days.
Then they had the Chaz and the Chad where they actually.
I mean, it's a good thing that these were universally condemned by Democratic leadership. It's a good thing that Democrats never pardoned these people.
Murdered 2 people?
Yep.
I completely agree with you, and in that I would love to be able to say, we should stop having these kind of like ignoring the law and stuff. But it's really, really tough to be like, well, we're going to be the people that are going to actually start doing that, and we expect the opposing political party to do the same when we don't really see that same kind of
Look at how they have to twist themselves into pretzels defending something that is so eminently indefensible. It is indefensible to pardon someone who beat the out of cops. Indefensible. And so they have to do this trick, because otherwise they would have to say, like, this is egregious. There's no excuse for this. No amount of whataboutism is going to justify this. It's just completely egregious for him to pardon someone who stole a baton from a cop and then beat him over the head with it. And yet here they are. Like, this is what being in the Trump cult does to you. You have to do these things. Your whole political philosophy rests on Trump. That's what it is. It's all him. So like, if he does it, it has to be okay in some way. And so they have to do this game with themselves where it's like, well, I understand, I'm not really comfortable with violent offenders on January, but like 2020 riots, they got to do this bullshit.
Feeling from the left. So
when that double standard we see over and over and over again. And I think it's really interesting. We're talking about Enrique Tarrio, who is a Proud Boys leader. The Southern
He wasn't even there.
Poverty Law Center brands the Proud Boys as a white supremacist group. Enrique Tarrio, as you guys should know, is black and Hispanic. So like, again, this kind of thing. And of course the SPLC monitoring hate, unless it's Antifa, unless it's, James.
There's a whole other whole thing over here where you got a lot of Hispanic people that firmly believe that like they're in the club when it comes to like white supremacy, right?
Revenge. So yes, we should have a blind justice system that treats attacks on police and attacks on federal buildings as serious, no matter which side you're coming from. We should also have a little bit more of an investigation in the pro-abortion vandalism and violence that we saw.
Oh yeah, I mean,
it's like there's case after case after case where we can say, and I do say in this book about the weaponization of law enforcement, that there is a clear bias. And I understand, a lot of people on the left feel embattled too. And it's partially because we have these echo chambers where we say, oh, we're the ones who are embattled. We're the ones who are embattled. We're the victims. But if you look at this issue of crime, the left has a lot more sway. You have a lot more prosecutors who've been funded by George Soros and the Open Society Foundations.
Around the country, we have more prosecutors. I don't know the facts.
There are 72. How many are there?
Of
total?
Funded by George Soros?
Yes, he did like 72 elections. So how many total are
Yeah,
there?
I don't know how
there's
many are
tens
still
of
in
thousands,
office.
I think. Let me
But they're,
Well, I think
they're all across.
it's like in
Did Tim Pool just say that George Soros has donated to tens of thousands of campaigns? Would that be true? I mean, he's a massive donor, but I'm very skeptical of tens of thousands of elections. But
cities.
Yeah, but the
Focus-
locations
yeah.
that his
The
that he
main
focuses
thing is
on are
the blue
influential.
cities where they've taken over, it's emboldened crime because they're not prosecuting people. for
2,300.
The policy is called restorative justice. The idea that that people that have been in oppressed groups or marginalized groups
Thank you,
have to
Grassroots.
be treated differently under the law, which is completely and totally antithetical to what we're talking about.
That's
here, you know?
antithetical to the Constitution,
Yeah,
and
it
that's
is.
antithetical to what our country was built on. When it comes to the Declaration of Independence, the grievances 8, 9, 18, and 19 all deal with captured courts, and the grievances 12.
if you're upset about George Soros's outsized influence in politics, you should be to the moon about what Elon Musk is doing. Elon Musk has taken that corrupt influence to a degree that we have heretofore never seen in the history of the country. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know what heretofore means. I used it correctly. Until this time or before now, we have never seen this level of influence by a single wealthy individual in this country. No one even close. Not even close. Ever.
12 and 15 deal with
Publicly. When we're talking about like the age of like the robber barons, and I'm sure there was tons of corruption in the 1800s and the turn of the century and all that. Like just out in the open. We've never seen someone do what Elon has done, spend billions of dollars purchasing a social media platform and then, manipulating that platform to boost right-wing content and personally invest tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars into in a single election cycle and then jockey for a position inside the White House. Like he successfully lobbied Trump to put Doge inside the White House. And now they're exploring policy changes in order to make available to Elon like sensitive information. Like Elon is fully on the inside. Anybody who's thinking that Doge is just going to be this performative thing in the background, no. They are setting up shop literally inside the White House. He has a direct line to the president and ostensibly will have the power to influence the regulatory agencies that provide in an oversight function a check against the private sector, i.e. SpaceX, Tesla, Boring Company, Neuralink. We've never seen that before. He goes so much further than George Soros. And it's so absurd that I don't even know why. Like, why do I even need to talk about this? Like, how is it not just immediately recognized as like, oh, this is insane. Like, this is absurd, right?
with 2 tiers of justice. So
I feel like the large shift that we've seen politically, like how Donald Trump ends up winning the popular vote, comes from a lot of moderates. You see Joe Rogan, Elon Musk, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., even someone like me. We are all liberal. I never consider myself like a Democrat, but if I went and voted,
Kidding me? Are you kidding me with this? You joking me with this? What do you mean you're liberal? What liberal principles do you have? This is when people like him are like, yeah, well, I'm for universal health care. Like, oh, okay, like what plan would you support? Why don't you want to? Are you pressuring Republicans to do this, or like, are you doing anything to like advocate for this universal health care that you want? You're right.
voted, it was just like straight Democrat, the 1 or 2 times I ever did. And then what ends up happening is I watch the news, and what do I see? I see far left rioters throwing firebombs, smashing things repeatedly over and over again. I personally end up going down and covering some of these riots and these protests. And I see instances where they get arrested. I was at Trump's inauguration in 2017, and there were hundreds of far left extremists who set fires, smashed windows. A limousine was torched. It was owned by an immigrant. It was a contractor who was doing rides. Numerous fires, and then they mass arrested several hundred people. I end up getting caught up in the what they call a police.
You just told me that they don't. You just told me that they don't do this to left wingers. They don't go after the left wingers. They just let them firebomb the. And now you're saying they mass arrested hundreds of people?
And I, as well as a few other journalists, presented our press cards, waited patiently, and eventually got released. These individuals who got arrested, who were clearly engaged in violence, ended up not only having their charges dropped, but they sued the federal government and won over $1 million. So here's someone like me, where it's like, I grew up Chicago.
He's probably speaking to like certain individual instances of people being like rounded up unjustifiably. I'm highly dubious of this idea, like that everybody got off and like, oh, then they got $1 million from the government. Like he never shows his work here.
Liberal, punk rock, all that stuff. And then I'm like, oh, that's how it goes. Then I see a bunch of right wingers go out and protest, and it's nationwide manhunt. And to the point where, well, I certainly agree anybody who's violent should go to jail. You hit a...
Well, Tim, they stormed the Capitol. I don't know how else to say that, but they stormed the Capitol on a day where they were certifying an election. So it's kind of a big deal, You
go to jail for that,
Yep.
I met one couple that showed up to the Capitol several hours after everyone had already left, and there were just people standing in the lawn. They walked up an open sidewalk, up to a building where the doors were wide open, no broken glass on the other side of the building, and they walked in and looked around and didn't know what was going on, didn't see anything, and then just left. And then I think it was a year later, they got their home raided, and this man and this woman were sentenced to 18 months in prison, and they had no idea why. So when I see them...
Really? They weren't giving charging documents? They had no idea why? They weren't told what they were charged with, Tim? Typically, when you're convicted of a crime and sentenced to jail, you know what you were convicted of. They have to tell you. It's public information. You can't just throw you in jail, right? There's a process.
I think that is why you end up with people saying, Trump, pardon everybody. We don't trust the system anymore. We've seen too much violence. Yeah. Go. I mean, you had those two individuals in New York who were giving out Molotov cocktails.
Look at this. Look at this. Look at this game they have to play with themselves. Look at this. Whatever it is, they will find a way to get there. Donald Trump tomorrow could ban, jeans, blue jeans. I don't like blue jeans. They come from China. And they would find a way to get there. Tim Pool would find a way to get there. Well, actually, you know what? I looked at the study from Denmark in 1972, and jeans, they give you chlamydia.
Slap on the wrist.
You talking about the lady that firebombed the car? Was that in Philadelphia?
The two lawyers.
Two lawyers were giving out Molotov cocktails in New York City.
Yeah.
And they end up getting a slap on the wrist. No federal charges. Akash Patel talked about it.
Right.
So that breaks my confidence in the justice system being fair and reasonable. And then when someone comes to me and says that Donald Trump is guilty of a crime, I say, yeah, I'm reading those documents. Someone comes to me and says Enrique Tarrio committed seditious...
But you didn't, you idiot! You didn't read the documents. We know this. If you're watching this on the YouTube VOD, just look up Tim Pool, Luke Beasley. They have a whole conversation about Enrique Tarrio. It was obvious. Tim had never read any of the underlying documents. Tim genuinely had no idea why Enrique Tarrio was charged with anything. He had no idea. Luke Beasley had to educate him on it. And then even after he got educated, he doubled down and was like, well, I don't see any evidence here.
Conspiracy, I say, yeah, right. I just don't believe it. I can't believe it. And I think that's the reasonable take. Not that it's wrong, but to start from a place of...
Tim Pool doesn't deserve rights. Like, he just doesn't. Serious. He just doesn't deserve rights. He doesn't.
Skepticism, and then say, show me the actual evidence, because the word of a jury and...
You were shown the evidence, and then you were like, well, I don't see any evidence. He showed you the evidence. Luke Beasley showed you the evidence 2 weeks ago, you dork. You dork! How do you not remember that? He remembers. He's lying. Okay?
90% Democrat district is not enough for me to believe someone actually did something wrong, at least right now.
Well, and that's the real tragedy of all of this, is that the weaponization of the prosecutions is the one thing. And of course, not a majority of the prosecutors across the country have been supported by George Soros. That wasn't what I was...
I think you're saying more liberal.
I was saying, yes, yeah. They tend to be more liberal. These...
Khanna. Oh boy. I got no love for Khanna. None.
Rogue prosecutors tend to represent the cutting edge, and they're seen as the cutting edge among the prosecutor community. And then you see many of these examples over and over again where there is not equal justice applied. And usually that's because of the prosecutors. Sometimes, unfortunately, it's also because of the juries. And I love our system of justice. I think the jury having the ultimate say is, it's ideal. But the problem is we're almost living in two different worlds where
You got that right.
the right and the left can't see eye to eye on almost
Let me
anything.
ask you this.
You got that right. You don't live in reality. These people do not live. Tim Pool does not operate in reality. He constructs his own reality where he and his movement and his movement's leader are shielded from accountability. And they never have to own up to anything, ever, 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 ever. Donald Trump laughed in a press conference yesterday about making billions of dollars in crypto while president. Capitalizing off of a shitcoin on the order of several $billion in profit while he is president. And I guarantee you that Tim Pool is not going to cover this shit. They don't care. They don't care. It does not matter. They don't care.
Especially because we're on Martin Luther King Day. If I would concede that there were some people who, like your couple, went in, shouldn't have been in, prosecuted for 18 months. And I also will tell you that anyone who engaged in violence, looting, rioting, whether they're doing it in the LA fires right now, should be locked up, or if they did it in response to George Floyd, which was, in my view, a total case of police gone rogue. But if the response to that has to be in the King's tradition of peaceful protest, would you though concede that historically and still today, if you're black in America, there is still often bias from the police force where you could be pulled over?
You're in the wrong crowd, bro. No, they're not going to acknowledge that. Are you kidding me? Are they? Maybe they will. No, come on.
In a way that you wouldn't be.
And then why are we moving away from the topic here? Like, why are you steering the topic away from the pardons? Like, what is this Khanna situation? I had so much faith in him too, and this is just so unimpressive.
If you were Indian or if you were in a certain neighborhood, and can you understand from the other perspective of some of these folks who were protesting, I'm not justifying it, how they see what you see as the law enforcement biased against those who are conservative, and they're saying, no, the law enforcement actually has been in certain places biased against us? Or do you think we've passed that?
There could be some bias there. The way the media covers it makes it suggest like it's an epidemic, and it's not.
I absolutely want answers. I will not concede that.
I told you, bro. Of course not. What podcast do you think you're on, Khanna? Jesus Christ. I mean, there's no other way to explain. So like the metric that I always point to that I think makes the point so easily, because there's just no other way to explain it, is various advocacy groups have done deep dive studies and looked at the data. And what they've discovered was that consistently all across the country, black men who are convicted of the same drug-related offenses as white people, adjusted for the same priors, are sentenced disproportionately longer than white people. How do you explain that if not for some kind of systemic bias that should probably be addressed in a meaningful way? And then we can get into like disagreements about how it should be addressed or whatever. But what possible explanation could you have for that? What is the innocent way to explain that? I don't know. I don't know of an innocent way to explain that. The same exact offenses, drug-related offenses, adjusted for the same exact priors, and black people are getting sent to jail longer than white people. How do you explain that?
And the reason why is from a logic standpoint. It would be impossible for a person, or largely impossible for a person, to know what the experience of another race is. So we hear stories, and we are told that black people in this country experience bias at the hands of police officers. I actually believe some of these stories are probably true, but it's hard to quantify it literally or numerically. And so,
well, not really. Like like what I said, you know, like we can look at like, okay, like how often are black people pulled over versus how many, you know, like we have numbers there. We do have data that we can point to. I mean, it's not like we can do perfect. We can answer every single question with perfect precision, but we actually have a shitload of crime data that we can parse through and identify systemically when there are things that disproportionately impact Black Americans, for example. The one that I gave you is just the perfect. Again, I don't know the innocent explanation for like why are they sentencing black people for longer for the exact same thing? Like how do you explain that? That's just one metric, but I just feel like it's the one to easiest make the point, the most easily make the point.
So the issue I run into is from the south side of Chicago myself. I saw no difference between the Mexican, white, mixed, Asian, black people in my community when the cops were hassling us. Then I see these stories from the left where they say the talk, something that white people don't understand. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Everybody in my neighborhood did the talk. When you were a kid in the south side of Chicago, be it white, black, Mexican, Asian, no matter what you were, your parents told you if you get pulled over, you turn your car off, you put the keys in the dash, you turn the dome light on, you turn the radio down, wallet on your dash, hands on the wheels, and don't move because a cop could shoot you. Everyone got that story. So then when I'm told that there are these racial...
I didn't get that story. And my dad's a cop. They never had a conversation. My dad never sat me down and said, here's what you do if you get pulled over. Never. And he's a cop. He just assumed that I wouldn't break the law because if I broke the law, I was going to get... It wouldn't have been great. We'll put it that way. But we never had that talk. Never had that fucking talk.
Disparities because cops are treating certain minority groups a certain way. I say... Okay, tell me the story. I hear a story from someone who's a minority, be it black, Mexican, or Indian or otherwise, and I say, that's crazy. I can't believe that happened to you. I have stories too. But then people tell me my stories don't count. Or what ends up happening to me is if I say I'm mixed, they say, see, it proves it. If I don't tell them I'm mixed, they say, you're white, you don't understand. There's for me...
You're getting to the heart of the issue, I think, and part of the reason Trump won is that there are a lot of people in working class neighborhoods, white working class neighborhoods, who have suffered tremendously because jobs were offshored, because of the opioid crisis, because they have not had economic opportunity. And one can say that is true and not deny their experience or look down upon them or make it kind of a pyramid of suffering or victimhood, and still acknowledge, in my view, that race also has a factor. It's not just, and that doesn't take away from the issue of people who are in the white and working class. And I think that's part of the challenge in this country is how do we have that conversation?
Well, I think humans are tribal, so race plays a factor. Politics can also play a factor. When you are perceiving someone who's different from yourself and you haven't been trained, as I think many of us rightly were in this room, to judge someone based on the content of their character, not the color of their skin, it's very easy to see in the other something that you dislike, that you think they're singling you out, that they're being, you know.
I feel like Martin Luther King is cringing out of his grave, like his corpse, decrepit corpse. Maybe half of it is turned to dust. Like it's just physically cringing and making its way like out of the grave. Now that right wingers have they now claim to be like the stewards of Martin Luther King's movement. You know, Martin Luther King advocated for reparations. Okay, let's not get it twisted. He straight up was like, this country owes us a financial debt. He certainly believed in systemic racism. The point of the I Have a Dream speech was that it was aspirational. It was not, we live in a colorblind utopia right now. It was, this is what we should aspire to be. Knowing that it's always going to be at least somewhat out of reach. You're never going to get there 100%. You're never going to get rid of every backward racist living in this country. That's just not going to happen, right? But the point is to endeavor to get as close as you can to that as possible. And one of the ways that he sought to do that was through reparations. And so to see Republicans these days try to co-opt his movement for their own backward, regressive, antiquated, delusional political philosophies it makes one cringe.
You know, I think that inherent distrust of tribalism is at the root of a lot of the perceptions of this supposedly widespread bias.
We had a video from, do you guys know King Randall? Personality. I think we've had him on the show before.
Yeah,
and
I think I've seen him.
He's a black man, and he made a video just last week, and he said, "I can't believe this happened to me. I got pulled over by the police." And he films himself as he gets pulled over. And the officer basically says, I pulled you over. He's like, no. He's like, well, you're speeding. He says, okay, license and registration. He hands him his ticket and says, just sign here. It's not an admission of guilt. It's just an acknowledgement of a receipt. He signs it. And he says, slow down for me, buddy. He says, you got it. Thank you, sir. And that's it. End of story.
Congressman, I think
that settles it. Not a problem. Not a problem. Pointing to anybody who's so pea-brained as to point to one singular example of something as if you can extrapolate from there and then make broader kind of claims. That's like pea-brain shit. That's like fifth grader shit. That's like you have not evolved mentally or intellectually to understand that, like, who gives a about your anecdotal, who gives a about your story? I don't give a about your story. What, like, we have meta studies. We have like billions of gigabytes of data of, to parse through. Why do I give a about your single story?
Today, like, I think agreeing with your point, maybe back in the day.
I got to tell you guys, personal story. I left my home yesterday and I walked to the store, got some things, came back from the store. Nothing happened to me. Nothing. Crime in this country doesn't exist. It's not real. It's all made up. People don't get murdered. People don't get robbed. People don't get essayed. People don't destroy property. If that happened, I would have seen it on my walk. I walked to the store and then I walked back. I didn't see anybody breaking any laws. None. So, quite frankly, I think Republicans are lying about crime. Crime doesn't exist in this country. Otherwise, I would have seen it on my walk.
It was certainly more easy. It's pretty fair that discrimination was pretty rampant in policing, let's say in the...
Didn't see any fires either. All this talk about fires in Southern California? Bullshit. I went for a walk yesterday. I didn't see any fires with my own eyes. Smelled some ash. Saw some ash on the sidewalk, admittedly. Yes. There's still ash on the sidewalk. But I didn't see any fires. So, yeah. Don't believe mainstream media. There are no fires in Southern California.
50s, right?
Early 90s.
I would say, yeah, sure. 60s, 70s, whatever. Mm-hmm. But today, I would argue that there's probably more demand for that racism than there actually is supply. Look no further than all the hoaxes we've seen recently, how much Democrat politicians leverage this, push this on their audience. I mean, I interview people all around.
Ro Khanna's just sitting there like this right now. Look at this. He's just sitting there like, what the bro? I thought he was one of the good ones, man.
Around the country. And most people are pretty darn good, right? You talk to a lot of people, they're honestly pretty great people. But you do run into people that genuinely...
He's trying to be agreeable, and I feel like with these people, you got to go scorched earth, right? Like, Josiah was on Tim Pool last week, and it was it was a good conversation, right? But I just think you gotta show up ready to bang, right? Bang it out.
Are like fearful of white.
No, I think he did well as well. I mean, like, I think both him and Luke came across as very well informed, but at the same time, it's Tim Pool. He is just such a dishonest guy. So I have mixed feelings about engaging with him as though he's like an honest broker. He's just so obviously lying.
People walking around because they believe that maybe they're connected to the Proud Boys or they're racist and they'll hunt them down in the street or something like that. And you're just like, in what reality is this the case, or how is this even possible? But it's because people, politicians and media figures leverage this stuff to a lot of times push fear on the American people. I genuinely don't think there's that much supply for it today as there is demand for it.
I will tell you though, I do think systemic racism exists. And so I'll clarify what that means, because I know a lot of people in the audience are going to say, Tim, you're wrong. There are systems that were built over a long period of time back when this country had overtly racist laws and policies that remain in effect as barriers. For instance, redlining and blockbusting, which were legal practices in Chicago and in many other places, left behind structural remnants that exist today. So if someone comes to me and says, my family is impoverished largely due to the actions taken in the 1950s, which...
That's crazy, dog. You just said a second ago that systemic racism didn't exist. Just said What, make up your mind.
Segregated us, and now we are struggling to get out of this area. That's absolutely 100% factually correct. The issue of individual biases, I think you made a great point about humans being tribal. I do agree with and think exists, but I think, outside of these structures, we have largely passed these laws to make that all illegal, and now I think the majority of the population is trying to avoid being racist, and they don't like being called racist, and we don't want that to be the principal issue. I do think we've largely dealt with it from a legal point, and now it's going to require, I think we have to be cognizant of these systems. Redlining and blockbusting, for instance, for those who don't know, redlining was when real estate companies would only sell property to black people in an area near the red line in Chicago, creating isolated pockets of racial segregation. And that results in, you don't have the same industry.
Generational disadvantages that ripple through to the present. So you have white families, and I've heard it described as like, imagine you're getting ready to play a game of Monopoly, and you got 4 of your friends, right? And then right before the game starts, they tell you, you got to sit out the first 50 turns. You have to just sit out. You can't build wealth. You can't invest in anything. You got to sit there and just let us play. And then you jump in on turn 50. I've heard that as a really good way to describe it. But if you have white families that were empowered to amass wealth and then pass that wealth down to their children, who then pass that wealth down to their children, and so on and so on and so forth, that is a family that has throughout generations been afforded the luxury of being able to amass wealth through real estate. If you're a black family and they were denied bank loans, or they were denied mortgages in certain areas, they've been systemically disadvantaged. Even if it happened 75 years ago, the consequences of that disadvantage or that discrimination, let's just call it what it is, from 1950 or 1940 or whatever, it has now rippled through the present. So if you acknowledge that, then you kind of have to acknowledge that like society would probably take some steps to like address that, right? And so then you have other systems that emerge like affirmative action or what people, DEI programs, these kinds of things. But it's just a case that these programs are now so broadly unpopular that it's just unpalatable, and it's just not, it's like a non-starter, like we're just, of course we're not going to do reparations. You would have to convince so many people, and I just don't see it happening, right? So you
don't have the same tax base, you don't have the same schools, you don't have the same skill sets as a robust, eclectic, educated area. Being aware of that, I think, is important. But I think blaming cops and calling them racist when police departments in big cities are even right, they have affirmative action for the past 20 or 30 years. I would say, I think we may have swung the pendulum a little bit too far in the other way, which is causing more problems.
Well, part of the challenge, I think, is that we've been having these conversations in silos. So if someone says, your point that you think that there isn't as much racism, the reaction on the left often could be, well, that's just a racist thing to say, and that puts you in a position of anger and defensiveness. And on the right, on the flip side, if someone says, no, I actually experience the world through race and come live it in my shoes, on the right, people say, oh, they're just engaging in identity politics, and they're just making...
For the first time in this entire pod appearance, he's actually, like, everything he's saying here is on the money, right?
This about race for advantage as opposed to being authentic. And the reality is those two groups aren't talking to each other. And one of the things...
Yeah, there's also a lot of, like, Eldon, I take your point. There's also a lot of, like, logistical problems for reparations. It's just really hard to imagine what it looks like in practice. So, like, I don't know, like, who qualifies, or like, does your bloodline need to be like 35% this or 25%? It's like, it's kind of unworkable. Like when I've yet to see a system that could like perfectly address the problem. And so like, ideally you would have like a class-based structure. So like I am of a left-wing persuasion, self-identify as progressive. And so I believe in some form of wealth redistribution. I believe in programs that can lift everyone out of poverty, right? And so like, but the spirit behind targeted programs is done in the spirit of reckoning with uglier parts of our nation's history and trying to right those wrongs. And maybe sometimes they're done in imperfect ways. But it's just at this point in our history, at this point right now in this moment, those programs just like, you know, I think most people approved of affirmative action going away. I think most people approve of getting rid of DEI programs. It's just whatever the pitch was for these programs just didn't work. It didn't land. And you can make the case according to the trends that we're seeing that it actually turned a lot of people off, you know. And Khanna's kind of speaking to this a little bit about like, well, how do you engage in these topics outside of your silo in a way that doesn't put the person that you're speaking with on the defensive or turn them off? You know, because oftentimes like progressives are just so bad at making the case for their policies in a way that doesn't come across as like smug or condescending or judgmental or belligerent, quite frankly. Like that's happening so much. I think it's obvious that like the progressive / social democrat / socialist kind of like coalition in this country has just like abysmally failed at compellingly making these arguments. And a lot of it just came across as like if people aren't educated on things like redlining, it's like, I think there is a bit of like, racist piece of shit, you know, like, and it just doesn't work. It's like that approach like just doesn't work, right? So
things we got to do is have their authentic people in the George Floyd protests, not the ones who rioted, who, you know, my friend Jamal Bowman, I mean, he will tell you what he thinks it's like being a black person in New York. And you should talk to him about where you think being white in a neighborhood was you had the same experience, and we ought to be able to have these conversations without labeling each other in a derogatory way.
Thanks for checking out this clip from
I don't disagree with that last part. I mean, just figuring out how to have the conversations is going to be really important moving forward, because just I think what we're seeing right now is a conservative backlash against perceived overreach, against perceived what the word is, hostility, I guess. Hostility. That's kind of what it is. A lot of lefties come across as like very hostile, very, very hostile. And I probably did some of that. I definitely did some of that at certain points in my life. I can look back and think about how I spoke and how I behaved, how I treated other people, and come to the conclusion of like, I was probably a little out of line. Now, when it comes to people like Tim Pool, he doesn't deserve rights. I don't take that back. I stand on that.